Hey there, and welcome to another journey back in time. Tonight, we're stepping into the misty, often mysterious world of medieval Europe, a time when the very idea of being a human being could get you accused of something far darker. Imagine this in a world where darkness always seemed to loom just beyond the horizon, where the sun was often obscured by thick clouds of uncertainty and the daily struggles of survival. Even the smallest of human behaviors, like a passing thought, a fleeting smile, or a momentary daydream, could be interpreted as evidence that something more sinister was at play. So, before we get fully immersed in this strange and curious period, I want to ask you to take a deep breath. Dim the lights. If you can, maybe even turn on a fan for that soft hum that's perfect for unwinding. But don't get too comfortable just yet. Let's ease into this together. Because once we step into this time, there's no turning back. You see, in the Middle Ages, something as simple as looking off into the distance could mark you as a person who had lost touch with reality. To a medieval villager, it wasn't just that you were gazing off into the horizon, perhaps imagining a better life, or daydreaming about a world beyond the dirt roads of your village. No, to them, you were committing something far worse, a crime of the mind. It was a crime that wasn't easily defined or understood, but it was one of the most dangerous crimes you could commit in the eyes of medieval society. Daydreaming, drifting off into your own thoughts, and even having a moment where your mind wasn't entirely fixated on survival work or the stern authority of the church, was a spiritual death sentence in the making. Yes, in the medieval worldview, if you dared to let your thoughts wander just a bit too far, the consequences could be far-reaching. Picture yourself as a peasant, perhaps no older than 20, though your body feels like it's lived 100 lifetimes. Your hands are calloused from hours of labor, hauling rocks, digging trenches, breaking soil, or doing any one of the countless exhausting chores that define your existence. The work is endless, and though the days drag on your body and soul, long for something beyond the relentless grind. And so your mind tries to escape. It slips away, if only for a brief moment, and you start to think about things that aren't on the list of things you need to do. Maybe you think about bread that actually tastes good. Not the gritty half-baked bread you choke down each morning, but a slice of something soft and warm, something that doesn't feel like you're chewing through gravel. Perhaps you imagine sleeping until the sun is high in the sky, not jolted awake by the rooster's aggressive crowing or the cold, damp air creeping in through the cracks in your cabin. For a moment, you allow yourself to imagine life without the endless cycle of work, hunger, and cold. But congratulations. In that single moment, you have committed a crime against the very fabric of medieval society. Because to them, when your eyes drifted from the present moment, it wasn't just a harmless mental escape. No, it meant you had ventured into territory far darker, and it meant that you were dangerously close to slipping into spiritual corruption. In the eyes of medieval villagers, people didn't simply zone out. No, they didn't just get lost in thought. To them, if you dared to let your thoughts wander, it was a clear sign that something wicked was afoot. You were conversing with demons, or worse, you were possessed. Imagine the shock, the fear, the utter terror that would grip the hearts of those around you. If they saw your gaze soften, your mind slip away for even a moment. Medieval society had no place for idle minds. In a world where distractions were few and far between, and where the very idea of taking a break or enjoying a moment of mental peace was foreign, a drifting thought was treated with the utmost suspicion. You see, life in medieval Europe was a battle for survival, a life of constant toil, of hunger, cold, and the ever-looming threat of disease or war. And in such a world where every hour of your waking day was dictated by hard labor, there was no room for mental relaxation, for imagination, or for quiet reflection. Your thoughts, your very mind, were viewed as something that needed constant vigilance. In such a world, it's no surprise that anyone who allowed themselves to mentally wander was immediately marked as suspicious. In fact, it was far worse than that. Daydreaming was no small thing. It was an invitation for trouble, a sign that you were spiritually weak and vulnerable. When someone saw you staring off into space, it wasn't just a harmless quirk. It was a signal that you were losing control of your mind, and the forces of darkness were quickly moving in to take hold. This belief didn't just exist in the minds of peasants. No, it was deeply ingrained in every layer of medieval society. Priests, nobles, and even children's parents saw the act of letting your mind wander as a dangerous path that led straight to spiritual ruin. You could be standing there in the middle of the field, your back aching from hours of work, when you caught sight of a butterfly fluttering by. Maybe you paused for a moment to marvel at its wings, delicate and fragile. But that brief moment of wonder was enough for someone nearby to notice. In their eyes, you weren't simply appreciating nature. No, you were listening to voices from beyond. You were hearing the whispers of fairies of spirits, or worse, of demons. And don't think for a second that this was limited to the simple folk. Even the nobles, those few with any semblance of leisure, were not immune to this constant suspicion. Imagine a prince tall and regal, standing by a window, gazing out over the kingdom. To us today, this might seem like a normal moment of reflection, of leadership, of strategy. But in medieval Europe, that same prince might have been viewed as a melancholic soul lost in thought, perhaps suffering from sorrow vapors, a term which, though it sounds sophisticated, simply meant that the prince was experiencing a mental or spiritual disturbance. Daydreaming, as we know it, might be considered normal today. But in the medieval world, it was a spiritual red flag. The act of simply letting your mind wander was not just an idle pastime. It was a sign that you had opened the door for something darker to slip in. In their eyes, no one could afford to drift too far from the task at hand, and this suspicion was not reserved only for those who spent their days in the fields or the castles. It was an illness that plagued every class of society, a fear that kept everyone on edge. This fear of wandering thoughts extended into every aspect of life. Even children, those tiny bundles of innocence, weren't exempt. If a child stared at the ground for too long, perhaps fascinated by an ant crawling across the dirt, Adults didn't just see a curious mind. They saw a child who was being lured into the world of elves, or worse spirits, who would soon have the child's soul for their own. So you see, even the simplest, most harmless behaviors were scrutinized. The very nature of the mind was under constant surveillance, constantly vulnerable to the whims of the spiritual world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because in the world of medieval Europe, not only were you at risk for being accused of being spiritually corrupted by daydreaming, talking to yourself, or being overly curious, but even your laughter, yes, something as simple and human as laughing, could set off alarm bells. The kind of laughter that came from a place of joy or even a small private joke could bring you the label of a madman, or worse, a possessed soul. We laugh today for many reasons. Humor is our release, our way of coping, of celebrating life, or simply finding a way to relieve the pressure of the world around us. But in the Middle Ages, laughter was never private, never personal. It was meant to be loud, communal, and most importantly, it needed to be triggered by something obvious. Something like a misstep, a fall, a moment of physical comedy. But the idea of laughing without reason, that was unthinkable. It was considered a breach of the natural order. You weren't laughing because of joy or amusement. No medieval people would believe you were laughing at something far darker. A joke told by a demon, a cruel laugh at the world that had no place in it. So, with all this in mind, we now begin our story. A tale of a world that was suspicious of every mental movement, every shift in human emotion. A world where no behavior, no matter how innocent, was free from scrutiny. Tonight, we dive deep into the medieval psyche. We explore how simple, harmless acts of humanity were turned into spiritual crimes. And as we do, we'll come to understand why in the Middle Ages, the smallest deviation from the expected was never just a quirk. It was a red flag that could send you straight into the hands of the Inquisition. Are you ready to enter this strange, dark world? Let's dive in and explore the medieval mind where every thought, every word, and every gesture held more power than we can imagine. Picture this. The sun is barely visible, its rays struggling to break through the dense rolling clouds that seem to settle over the land like an endless gray blanket. It's the sort of day that seems to sap the very life out of the earth beneath you. A dull, muddy day where the air smells of wet soil and the wood of the village homes leaks moisture like forgotten tears. You're standing in the field, your back aching from hours of labor, hands rough and cracked from hauling stones, plowing the soil, or perhaps collecting firewood. Whichever task you've been assigned for the day. The world around you is a blur of hard work, cold air, and the monotonous sounds of your fellow villagers scraping at the earth. The sound of your own breathing is almost drowned out by the rhythmic thudding of a hammer in the distance, a sound that if you stop and listen for long enough, begins to feel as though it too is slowly wearing down your soul. You've been at it for hours now, your body begging for rest, your muscles sore and worn. As you lift your hand to wipe the sweat off your brow, you notice the sky. Just for a second. A fleeting moment where your mind slips from the task at hand. A tiny crack in the otherwise unwavering focus on survival that demands every ounce of your attention. You're not even aware of it at first. Your gaze drifts upward, following the motion of a bird, a hawk perhaps, or maybe a crow. It soars above the fields, its wings cutting through the gray like a fleeting moment of freedom in a world that offers very little of it. For a moment, you imagine what it might be like to fly free of the heavy burden of hard work, free of the endless cycle of toil. You imagine a world where your body isn't aching, a world where you're not tied down by the unrelenting needs of survival. You let your mind wander just for a moment, just a brief respite from the endless demands of life. But before you know it, your peaceful little escape is interrupted. The moment it happens, you don't even realize the gravity of the danger you've put yourself in. The village priest, Father Gregory, who happens to be wandering by with his staff and his stern face, sees your momentary lapse. His sharp eyes lock onto you instantly, narrowing with suspicion. You can almost feel the weight of his gaze pressing on you, heavy with judgment, as if he can already read your thoughts, already know what's going on inside your head. It doesn't take long before he's at your side, his voice breaking through the silence like a crack of thunder. "What enters your thoughts, child?" he demands, his voice booming with an authority that leaves you no room to hide. The words sting, cutting through the air like an accusation before you even have a chance to think about your response. You open your mouth to speak, but the words catch in your throat. You've only been thinking, just daydreaming, for a split second, a fleeting moment of relief. But to Father Gregory, that is all it takes to mark you as suspicious. In that moment, your mind races. How do you explain the seemingly innocent daydream to a man who believes every stray thought could be the work of the devil? A man who has seen too many possessed souls to allow such weakness in his flock. What was once a moment of mental escape, a simple wandering thought, has now become a crime in the eyes of your community. Daydreaming in the medieval world was not just an innocent act of letting your mind wander. It was dangerous. It was an open door, an invitation for something darker to creep in, something unholy. You try to explain yourself, but it's no use. The priest's face is hard as stone, his lips pressed into a thin line. In the Middle Ages, your thoughts were not your own. The very idea of mental wandering was an affront to the rigid structure of medieval life, where every action, every moment of thought had to serve the greater good of the community of God. To allow your mind to wander, to entertain thoughts that weren't rooted in the divine or in earthly toil, was a sign of spiritual weakness, a crack in the armor that protected you from the dangers of the supernatural. Father Gregory doesn't listen to your excuses. He has already begun muttering under his breath an incantation of sorts as he reaches for the small vial of holy water at his side. It doesn't matter that your daydream was harmless, that you weren't entertaining any thoughts of malice or sin. The fact remains you let your mind slip, and that was all the evidence Father Gregory needed. Your mere daydream was enough for him to believe you were spiritually compromised, your soul already slipping toward the dark forces that he knew lurked just beyond the veil of human understanding. It's a quiet, terrifying moment, one that leaves you shaken, unsure of what will happen next. You're marked. You've done nothing more than take a breath. Pause for a moment of relief from the endless work. But in the eyes of Father Gregory and the rest of the village, you've committed a serious transgression. The thought police are here, and they will not hesitate to report your infraction to the authorities, to the Inquisition, the very people who will come knocking at your door to investigate your every move. The fear grips you cold and sharp as you realize that in this world there is no room for such simple human moments of escape. You see, daydreaming wasn't just seen as a harmless distraction in medieval Europe. It was seen as an invitation for something far darker. It was an open door for demons to slip in, for unholy forces to take hold of your mind, your soul. The medieval church, which wielded immense power over the lives of the people, believed that the mind was a battlefield, a place where good and evil waged war constantly. And if you dared to let your mind slip even for a moment, you were opening yourself up to spiritual corruption. That one small moment of escape was enough to draw suspicion. You might think this sounds extreme, but in the context of medieval Europe, it was perfectly logical to the people who lived there. After all, this was a time of constant fear and hardship. The medieval world was one where disease, famine, and war seemed like inevitable facts of life, where the natural world was full of mysteries that were often perceived as threats. People didn't have the luxury of knowing what we know today. They didn't have the tools to understand the workings of the human mind, so when something went wrong, when someone appeared to slip out of the tight grip of reality, they turned to the only explanation that made sense to them: the devil was at work. To the medieval mind, daydreaming was a spiritual red flag. It was a sign that you were allowing your mind to drift away from the path of righteousness. It meant that instead of focusing on God, on work, or on the responsibilities that society had placed on you, you were opening yourself up to spiritual infection. It wasn't just that you were wasting time or being lazy. No, you were inviting danger. You were putting your very soul at risk. It's not hard to imagine why such a belief system would lead to inquisitorial investigations. The medieval church had a vested interest in keeping people under control, keeping them focused on their duties, and making sure that the line between good and evil was clearly drawn. The church wasn't just concerned with the soul, it was concerned with power. And power came from keeping people obedient, keeping them focused on God, and keeping their thoughts free from distractions. If someone strayed from that path, even for a moment, it was a threat to the whole social order. And so, the Inquisition, the body tasked with rooting out heresy and spiritual corruption, was ever watchful for signs of mental wandering. In their eyes, the mere act of daydreaming was enough to mark you for investigation. In the eyes of the Inquisition, even a fleeting moment of mental escape could be the opening act in a much larger spiritual crisis. It wasn't just that your thoughts were dangerous. It was that you were losing control over your very soul. Imagine for a moment the consequences of being caught in this mental crime. The Inquisition wasn't known for its kindness or mercy. Once you were marked as suspicious, the investigation would begin. Your every word, every thought would be scrutinized. The holy water that Father Gregory sprinkled on you was just the beginning. It was a signal to others that you were in need of spiritual cleansing, and soon the priests would come to perform more invasive rituals to purge you of whatever demonic influence had taken hold. The idea of the mind as a battlefield was one that the medieval church took very seriously. And the more you allowed yourself to slip away from the task at hand, the more you became a target for suspicion. It wasn't enough to just perform your physical duties. You had to do so with full mental and spiritual focus, always vigilant, always on guard. Even the slightest lapse in mental clarity could be seen as an opening for evil forces to invade. In a society that was already plagued by superstition, disease, and fear, it was a system designed to keep people under constant surveillance, under constant suspicion. And so daydreaming, in this context, became a serious offense, a gateway to spiritual damnation. For medieval people, it wasn't just a passing moment of mental escape. It was an invitation to chaos. And once that invitation was extended, there was no telling where it would lead. It wasn't just your reputation that was on the line. It was your very soul. Daydreaming might seem like an innocent act today, something we all do from time to time. But in medieval Europe, it was far more than that. It was a crime. And that's the tragic, strange reality of the time, a world where even your thoughts were never truly your own, and where a simple moment of mental escape could lead you straight into the hands of the Inquisition. Imagine the scene you're in, the quiet of the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, its pale light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows over the dirt road outside your cottage. The sounds of the village have quieted for a moment. No hammering, no shouting, just the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional distant crow of a rooster. It's a rare moment of peace in a life that has been anything but peaceful. You've been working non-stop, your hands raw and your muscles stiff from the hours spent laboring in the fields, the kitchen, or perhaps tending to the animals. The weight of exhaustion is heavy, and for just a moment, you let your mind drift. It's a luxury you rarely afford yourself, but it's a necessity. The mental weight of everyday life, of surviving in a world that offers so little respite, is enough to drive anyone mad. You take a breath, and for a moment, you talk to yourself. You mutter almost unconsciously the words slipping from your lips. Perhaps you're reminding yourself of something, what needs to be done tomorrow, what you forgot to do today. Or maybe you're comforting yourself, saying the words out loud, feeling the presence of your own voice, a small human connection to something familiar in a world that is often too harsh. Perhaps you whisper to the air, to the birds, to the house, to the only companion you truly trust. It doesn't matter what you say, because in your mind, it's just you lost in the solitude of the moment, simply processing the weight of the day. But then there's a shift. You hear footsteps behind you, sharp and sudden, interrupting the brief calm. The floor creaks as someone approaches, and before you can even turn around, the figure of Father Gregory, always so serious, always so vigilant, appears in the doorway. His eyes lock onto you instantly, his gaze piercing through the air, his brow furrowed in that all too familiar expression of suspicion. You freeze. The words you were muttering trail off into nothingness, but the damage has been done. He's seen it. He's heard it. Talking to yourself, are we? Father Gregory's voice is low, but there's an unmistakable edge to it. He steps forward slowly, the sound of his heavy boots dragging on the wooden floor, and you feel a chill settle into your bones. Your heart starts racing. What was once an innocent moment of self-reflection, a fleeting conversation with yourself, has now become an act of spiritual transgression. You try to explain, to say that it was nothing, that you were simply thinking out loud, but the words die in your throat. Father Gregory is not interested in your explanation. In fact, he doesn't even hear you. His mind is already at work, calculating, analyzing, interpreting. For Father Gregory, talking to oneself is not a quirky habit, a sign of a weary soul trying to make sense of the world. No, it's something far darker. It's a signal, a warning, a red flag. Talking to yourself is a direct line to the supernatural. It's an invitation for something unholy to enter your thoughts, to control your words, and to corrupt your soul. To medieval clergy, your voice was not just a sound, it was a vessel, a conduit that could carry demons, spirits, and whispers from beyond the physical world. To them, every conversation with yourself was a conversation with something far more sinister, something beyond human understanding. Father Gregory doesn't wait for you to explain yourself. He doesn't give you the chance to rationalize. Instead, he crosses the room with alarming speed, his eyes now wide with a mixture of fear and determination. His hand reaches for the vial of holy water that always hangs from his waist, the small glass bottle shaking slightly as he uncorks it with a quick twist. Without a word, he sprinkles the holy water onto you, onto your hands, your face, your body, as if he is trying to cleanse the very air that has touched you. You wince at the cold splash, but there's no time to react. The ritual has begun. The ritual isn't for your benefit. No, it's for the benefit of the village, for the benefit of the community that will now watch and whisper. The moment you uttered those words to yourself, you became the focus of suspicion, of paranoia. And in this world, paranoia spreads like wildfire. People don't just assume you're alone in your mind. They assume you've opened a door that should never be opened. And the village is full of eyes that are quick to see, quick to report. Father Gregory is not the only one who believes that words spoken to no one are words spoken to something else. The villagers, already uneasy in a world where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual are so easily blurred, hear your voice, whether it's just a mumble, a sigh, or a full-fledged soliloquy, and they know. They know something is wrong. A person talking to themselves, muttering in solitude, is not to be trusted. It's the mark of someone who has opened themselves up to something dangerous. In a world where death and disease hover just out of sight, the fear of the supernatural is very real. And your brief, private moment of solitude has just made you a target. You are no longer just a tired villager. You are someone who has invited spiritual danger into your life, into your soul, and into the fabric of your very being. The suspicion begins to ripple outward. Neighbors start to notice the small, seemingly harmless act. Perhaps they hear you from their window as they walk by, or see you standing there, your lips moving with no one around. They exchange glances, muttering to themselves, whispering in low voices as they gather in the town square. You become the subject of gossip, the topic of hushed conversations as your neighbors wonder if you've been touched. Are you possessed? Are you in league with demons? Have you become so weary from life's burdens that your soul is starting to fray at the edges? Your simple act of speaking to yourself is no longer seen as an attempt to manage your thoughts. No, it is seen as a breach of the order that holds the village together. And once the gossip begins, there is no stopping it. In a community as tight-knit as this one, rumors have a life of their own. The more they spread, the more people start to believe them, and the more convinced they become that something is truly wrong with you. No longer are you just the tired farmer or the humble weaver. You are now someone whose very thoughts are suspect, someone whose soul is in danger of being consumed. The idea of you, a simple human being talking to yourself, is so foreign, so strange, that it becomes an invitation for every shadowy fear to surface. And the worst part, once you're marked, it's hard to shake off the stain. You've become spiritually contaminated in the eyes of your peers. The suspicion that's settled over you is like a thick fog that won't lift no matter how much you try to explain or defend yourself. And in a world where every little act is scrutinized, where everyone is looking for a reason to justify their fear, your every move is now being watched. The moment you spoke to yourself, you invited not just suspicion, but intervention. You called upon the village clergy to act, and they will not leave you alone. What happens next is entirely out of your control. Perhaps you're brought before the village council, the elders, and the priest, and perhaps you're interrogated, asked again and again what exactly you were saying to yourself, what thoughts you were entertaining, what demons were trying to whisper in your ear. They don't trust your answers. They can't. To them, every word you speak, every thought you entertain could be the gateway to something far darker than you can imagine. And the truth of the matter is, you are caught. You can't escape the suspicion, the fear that now clings to you like a shadow. Perhaps you will be sent for further spiritual cleansing, a ritual to purge you of whatever demonic influence is assumed to have taken hold. Perhaps you'll be asked to confess to reveal the source of your sinful thoughts, to explain why you felt the need to talk to yourself. But no matter how you explain it, the truth will always be the same. In their eyes, you've opened a door, and that door, once opened, is hard to close. But this isn't just about one person talking to themselves. It's about a culture, a society that lives in constant fear of what lies just beyond the veil. A society where mental illness, mental wandering, or just plain tiredness was misinterpreted as a spiritual crisis. And so, the clergy, Father Gregory, and others like him stand as the gatekeepers, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of trouble. Your mental state is no longer just your own. It belongs to the community, to the church, and to the supernatural forces they believe are ever present, watching, waiting for the smallest misstep. In the Middle Ages, to talk to yourself wasn't just eccentric. It was an emergency, a spiritual crisis, an invitation for the devil to step in, to turn your mind away from God and into dangerous territory. Your thoughts weren't just your own. They were under constant surveillance, under constant threat of being corrupted. And when that corruption was suspected, there was no room for leniency. The only way to deal with such a crisis was with intervention, with ritual, with forceful correction. To talk to yourself in that world meant you were no longer fully in control of your own soul. And so your quiet musings, your words whispered to the air, your attempt at self-reflection, or perhaps even just a simple frustration with the endless weight of life, become a battle for your very existence. You are no longer just you. You are now the embodiment of every fear, every superstition, every paranoia that medieval Europe had to offer. In the heart of the village, amidst the perpetual buzz of daily labor and the scent of damp earth children, were often the most observed, the most scrutinized, and the most vulnerable. To the adults, their innocence was both a blessing and a curse, a delicate thing easily tainted by unseen forces that lurked just outside the boundaries of the visible world. In a community steeped in superstition, a child's wandering gaze, their distracted attention, or even their occasional daydreaming was enough to send waves of suspicion rippling through the village like a stone dropped into a still pond. A simple act, like a child staring at a butterfly, flitting by, or gazing absently at the floor, could quickly become a red flag signaling to the watchful eyes of parents, priests, and neighbors that something unnatural was afoot. Imagine this scene. A small child, no older than 5 or 6, sits in the corner of the village square, their feet kicking lazily at the dirt. The sun is out, casting a golden glow over the field, and the child's attention drifts to a fluttering butterfly that dances in the air, its delicate wings painted in colors so vibrant they seem almost unreal. The child's eyes follow it as it flits from flower to flower, lost in the simple beauty of the moment. Their face is serene, their body still. It is a fleeting moment of innocence, one that every parent should cherish, right? But in medieval Europe, that very stillness was a cause for alarm. As the child watches the butterfly, the local woman, who has spent most of her day bent over her fire pot preparing stew notices, she glances over her shoulder, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Her gaze lingers on the child's face for a moment too long, an almost imperceptible shiver running through her. She turns away, but not before making a mental note. There's something off about this. It's the way the child is staring so fixed on the butterfly, as if it's not just a creature of nature, but something more, something other, something magical. By noon, the gossip has spread through the village. Did you see little Owen today? One neighbor whispers to another. That boy, he was staring at the butterfly, like he was listening to it. The other nods solemnly. Aye, it wasn't just a stare. His eyes were so wide, almost as if he was hearing it speak. Maybe the fairies are talking to him, or worse, maybe the elves. The thought sends a ripple of unease through the village. In a world where the natural and supernatural were constantly at odds, the distinction between a child's innocent musings and the dark influences of the Fae was razor thin. The elderly woman who had first noticed Owen's behavior is not one to simply ignore what she believes is a sign of something much darker. She seeks out the village priest, her face drawn with worry. She tells him what she saw. The child staring mesmerized by the fluttering creature, as if entranced. "It's the elves, Father," she insists, her voice trembling with concern. "He's listening to them. I know it. I've seen it before." Father Gregory listens intently, his brow furrowing as he nods solemnly. "We cannot let this go unchecked," he replies. "The presence of the supernatural in a child's life is a grave matter. I'll have a word with Owen's parents. If there's anything more to it, we cannot afford to wait." And so it begins, the suspicion. The quiet, deadly suspicion that slowly creeps its way through the village, taking root in the hearts of every adult who hears the story. To an outsider, this might seem like a simple, harmless moment. An innocent child gazing at a butterfly, lost in a world of imagination. But in the world of medieval Europe, this was a serious matter. It wasn't just a child being a child. No, this was something far more dangerous. The village's obsession with watching children's every move came from a deep-seated fear of the supernatural, and in particular, the belief that fairies, elves, and other mystical creatures were lurking just beyond the edges of their vision, waiting for the slightest opportunity to take hold of a child's soul. Children, after all, were seen as the most vulnerable to these influences. Their minds were believed to be open, unguarded, ready to receive messages from otherworldly beings if left unchecked. In many ways, a child's innocence was not something to be cherished, but something to be protected, kept safe from the forces that would seek to lead them astray. As word of Owen's strange behavior spreads, the fear becomes palpable. Parents keep their children closer to them. They are no longer allowed to wander freely in the fields or play alone in the square. Each action is monitored, each moment of silence scrutinized. If a child looks at the ground for too long, stares off into space, or seems momentarily lost in thought, it is no longer an innocent act. It is a potential sign that the child is in contact with something unnatural, something dangerous. The village now keeps an eye on young Owen, watching for any further signs that he may be under the influence of these supernatural forces. One afternoon, as the children gather to play near the village well, Owen is once again caught in a quiet moment of daydreaming. His gaze drifts to the floor, his eyes fixated on the cracks in the earth, as if he's listening to a whisper no one else can hear. To the adults, it is unmistakable the child is communing with spirits, with beings from another world, and it is not something they are willing to ignore. The priest arrives at the cottage shortly after his footsteps, heavy and deliberate on the dirt path. His expression is stern, his mind already made up. He doesn't need to see anymore. The behavior is enough. It's not just a wayward glance. It's a sign of something far darker. Owen Father Gregory begins his voice low and steady. "You've been hearing things, haven't you?" Voices whispers. "I need you to tell me the truth. What are you listening to? What is it that's been speaking to you?" The child's eyes widen in fear, and his lips tremble as he stammers, unsure of what to say. He hasn't heard anything. It's just his imagination, just the simple act of a child lost in a moment of wonder. But to the priest, the doubt in the child's eyes is confirmation. It's an act of rebellion against the order of the world, a sign that the boy has fallen under the sway of the Fae. Father Gregory doesn't wait for an answer. He orders the child to be taken to the village healer, an elderly woman who is skilled in the ways of curing those who have fallen under the influence of supernatural forces. She will perform a ritual, a cleansing, to remove the taint from the child's spirit. The entire village watches as Owen is led away, his small figure trembling with the weight of an accusation he doesn't fully understand. This is the reality of life in medieval Europe. A child's innocent behavior, something we might dismiss as daydreaming or simple curiosity, is interpreted through the lens of fear and superstition. The villagers, having known nothing but hardship, disease, and death, see the world through a different lens. They cannot afford the luxury of seeing a child's wandering thoughts as harmless. No, in their world, the mind was a battleground, and the child's soul could easily be lost to forces they could not control. Owen's story is far from unique. Throughout medieval Europe, children were watched, scrutinized, and carefully guided to ensure they did not slip into dangerous territory. Any sign of distraction, any moment of inward focus, could quickly spiral into something far more sinister. The very act of daydreaming could be a gateway to otherworldly influence. The fear was not just that the child might stray from the path of righteousness. It was that they might invite something darker into their hearts, something that could not be undone. In this world, the line between innocence and suspicion was razor thin, and the consequences of crossing it were steep. To the villagers, it wasn't just about keeping their children safe from harm. It was about preventing the very real possibility that supernatural forces might be working through them, whispering in their ears, guiding them into dark realms where the laws of the earth no longer applied. And so day after day, children were watched. Their every move was observed, their every glance scrutinized, for in a world so full of fear and uncertainty, there was no room for even the slightest deviation from the norm. Every moment of stillness, every moment of wandering thought could be a sign that something was amiss. Something that could destroy not just a child, but an entire community. In medieval Europe, the supernatural was never far away. It was always present just beyond the edges of perception, waiting for the slightest opening. And for children, those openings were everywhere. In the high stone halls of the medieval castle, where the air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the heavy tapestries hung in solemn silence, the world moved at a pace far removed from the hurried rhythms of the peasant villages below. The aristocracy, wrapped in the warmth of luxury and political power, lived in a world of glittering privilege. But even they were not immune to the watchful eyes of suspicion that gripped medieval society. Though their bloodlines were noble and their names carried weight, their moments of stillness, of contemplation, or of absent-minded daydreaming were often no less dangerous than the wandering thoughts of a peasant. Imagine a young prince, his face drawn, in a rare moment of solitude, standing in a grand chamber, adorned with fine velvet curtains and delicate stained glass windows. His gaze drifts out the window, where the green hills of his lands stretch beyond the horizon, the soft golden light of the setting sun painting the landscape in hues of amber and rose. For a moment, he is lost in thought, his mind wandering far from the weight of his royal duties, far from the politics and the constant pressure to lead. He wonders, perhaps, about the lives of those who live outside the walls of the castle of the common people, who toil and struggle, who find joy in the simple things that seem so far out of reach for him. But what does it mean for a prince, a member of the nobility, to daydream? To slip into the realm of reflection and distraction for just a brief moment. In the medieval mindset, it means far more than it does for a commoner. It is not seen as a personal indulgence, an innocent escape from the burdens of power. No, to the clergy, to the villagers, and to the courtly advisors who keep a close eye on every member of the elite, a prince's melancholy. His quiet contemplation, or his distracted wandering thoughts, can quickly become the subject of deep concern. Father Gregory, the same priest who had once intervened in the life of a peasant child, lost in his own thoughts, now steps into the prince's chamber. He had been called here not because the prince's thoughts were offensive in any obvious way, but because they were dangerous in a more subtle, insidious manner. His Majesty, young and vibrant though he may seem, has fallen prey to what the Church has come to label sorrow, vapors, a condition the clergy is quick to diagnose when a noble's melancholy shows itself too publicly. Father Gregory approaches the prince with a mixture of concern and ritualistic professionalism. He knows the rules well. The prince's mood is not to be dismissed. No, it must be addressed immediately before it spreads like a poison through the royal court, infecting others with doubt, despair, or worse, spiritual disorder. For the nobility, their souls were seen as highly susceptible to the corruption of the mind. A noble's contemplative moments, especially if they occurred without external stimulation, were interpreted as invitations for the devil to enter, to work his magic on the mind of the elite. My Lord Father Gregory intones his voice heavy with the solemnity of his office. I must speak with you about the matter that has caused some concern among your advisors. It has been noted, my lord, that you have been reflective lately, that you have been gazing out of the windows at the landscape, lost in thought, as though seeking answers beyond your grasp. The prince's eyes flicker momentarily, a flash of irritation passing over his face. He is not a man accustomed to being watched, especially not by men of the church, but he says nothing. He knows this moment will not pass without acknowledgement, and despite his frustration, he feels the weight of the priest's words. The church is never far from power, and the influence of the clergy extends deep into the courts of the nobility. You are melancholy, my lord. Father Gregory continues, though the prince does not speak. The symptoms are clear. The distant gaze, the lack of engagement with your court, the withdrawal from the responsibilities of rule, all of these point to a condition that I fear is spiritual in nature. It is not enough for you to simply feel sadness or reflect on the world around you. No, this is something darker, something that cannot be left unchecked. The devil may use such moments to plant seeds of doubt in your heart. The prince remains still, his mind caught between frustration and a reluctant sense of helplessness. He has no real words to express his feelings, no way to justify his longing for something more, for a connection beyond the political machinations of the court. beyond the endless negotiations with other realms beyond the cold rituals of power. But he knows well enough what the priest means. Sorrow vapors, as the church calls it, has long been a recognized condition among the nobility. It is not merely sadness. It is not just a passing moment of despair. It is something much more dangerous, a spiritual malady that may threaten the very stability of the kingdom. In medieval Europe, mental health was not a concept understood as we know it today. The human mind, especially the mind of a noble, was not just a private space. It was a divine reflection, an image of the power of God. A prince's mind was not just the domain of his own thoughts and desires, but also a space that had the potential to influence the fate of his people, to shape the destiny of the realm. A prince's melancholia, therefore, was not a trivial matter. It was not something that could be left to the whims of personal reflection. It was a matter that demanded intervention, spiritual intervention, in the watchful eyes of the church. In the eyes of the clergy, a noble's daydreaming, his withdrawn contemplation, was seen as something akin to a spiritual crisis. The noble, having the privilege of access to leisure wealth and education, was believed to be at greater risk of spiritual corruption than the common folk. For the commoners, their lives were simple and grounded, with their days filled with labor. They were too consumed by survival to entertain the luxuries of introspection. But for the nobility, who had the time and space to look inward, there was always the danger of straying from the path of righteousness. A prince who gazed out at the land, who withdrew from his court and his duties, who sought solace in his own thoughts, was a prince who could easily become a vessel for the forces of darkness. As Father Gregory speaks, the prince feels the familiar gnawing sense of confinement, the same feeling that has haunted him for weeks, for months. He feels like a caged bird in a gilded cage, free in form, yet trapped by the very structure that is supposed to give him wings. The prince has been wrestling with this malaise, this sense of being weighed down by the responsibility of his crown, by the expectations placed upon him by his father's legacy, and by the pressures of ruling a kingdom that seems to stretch endlessly before him. Yet none of these thoughts, none of these feelings can be articulated. He is expected to lead, expected to be a pillar of strength. Yet all he can feel is the quiet pressure building in his chest, the longing for something more than the ceaseless politics, the endless performances, the ever-present gaze of those who watch, always watching. Father Gregory's voice cuts through the prince's thoughts once again. My lord, you must understand that such moods are not just personal misfortunes. They are spiritual crises. The mind, when left unchecked, can be a battlefield. The devil does not wait for you to turn your gaze away. No. He waits for you to turn your thoughts inward, to reflect too deeply. And in that moment, he whispers his poison into your ear. The prince's gaze hardens, but Father Gregory does not notice. The priest is too wrapped up in the notion of spiritual warfare, too fixated on the medieval idea that the mind was always at risk of becoming a battleground for the forces of good and evil. For the prince, this is not about the devil. It is about the weight of his own thoughts, the heaviness of a life spent under the constant expectation to perform, to be perfect, to be the figurehead of an entire kingdom. He is not battling demons. He is battling himself. But no one else will understand that. Father Gregory certainly won't. In the eyes of the clergy, the prince's melancholia, his quiet contemplation, was nothing more than a symptom of a deeper spiritual corruption, a sign that his mind was no longer safe, that the path to righteousness was being slowly poisoned. And in this world, where the spiritual and the temporal were inseparable, the prince's thoughts could never be private, not truly. They were always vulnerable to being shaped, twisted, and diagnosed by the watchful eyes of those who claim to understand the workings of the soul. The prince listens, his heart sinking. He knows what will come next, the ritual cleansing, the holy water, the prayers, the insistence that he feel better, that he restore his mind to its rightful place. But deep down, the prince knows that his mind, his very soul, has been irrevocably changed. And no amount of prayers or rituals can unmake that change. His mind is not a battlefield between good and evil. It is a quiet storm of confusion, uncertainty, and despair. Yet he remains silent, playing his part. For what else can he do in a world that sees his melancholy as a threat? As the priest leaves the room, the prince stands alone, staring once again out the window, his thoughts wandering back to the hills in the distance. For a brief moment, he wonders if this will ever change, if he will ever find the peace he craves. But deep down, he knows the answer. In the medieval world, there is no room for such peace. Not for a prince, not for anyone. The ritual will continue. The cleansing will happen. But the prince, like so many before him, will never truly be free. He will always be watched, always be measured, always be expected to perform. His daydreams will never again be his own. And in the eyes of the world, that will be his greatest sin. The wind howled outside the thatched cottage, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the scent of wet earth and dying leaves. The village was a quiet, oppressive place, the kind of place where joy was not so much a welcome guest as it was an unwelcome intruder. The air, heavy with the weight of hardship, hunger, and endless toil, did not leave much room for laughter. It was a luxury that belonged to those who had nothing else to concern them, or so it seemed to the medieval mind. The people who lived in this world were bound to the earth, to the daily labor that consumed every waking moment. Life was a constant struggle against the elements, against disease, and against the ever-present specter of death. Joy was a fleeting thing, a momentary escape from the crushing weight of reality. And because of that, when it did appear, it was viewed with suspicion. Imagine the scene in the village square, a small, humble gathering of peasants huddled together under the eaves of a merchant's cart, shielding themselves from the sudden autumn rain. They speak in low voices, sharing gossip and news from distant lands, when suddenly, from the corner of the group, a single laugh rings out. It is not a hearty laugh, nor one prompted by the ridiculous antics of a jester or a neighbor tripping over a bucket. No, this laugh is quiet, almost delicate, and it seems to come from nowhere. Just a burst of sound, spontaneous and pure, as if the person who made it has found something amusing in the bleakness of life. The others fall silent immediately. their eyes flicking to the source of the laughter. The sound lingers in the air like a foreign substance disrupting the usual murmur of voices. For a moment, no one speaks. The rain continues to fall, but it is as if the world has momentarily stopped. In the stillness, the laugh seems to echo louder than it should, as if calling attention to itself. To the people in the square, it is out of place. It is wrong. Laughter in the medieval world was not meant to come from within. It was not a private thing, an individual expression of happiness or relief. It was supposed to be a shared experience, a communal sound that arose from the collective misfortunes and absurdities of life. Laughter was meant to be loud, boisterous, and public, caused by a physical spectacle, a misstep, a fall, or a catastrophe. It was not something that bubbled up from the quiet of one's mind without a clear external trigger. Laughter was a sign of joy, and joy was an anomaly in a world built on suffering. And anything out of the ordinary, anything that disrupted the natural order, was suspicious. The village folk stare at the woman who laughed, their faces a mixture of confusion and discomfort. They know her. She is the widow of the blacksmith, the woman who has spent the last few years in grief, mourning her husband, who died in a mill accident. Her laughter is jarring, like the sound of something shattering. She should not be laughing. She has nothing to laugh about. Her life is filled with the weight of loss and struggle. The village gossip standing nearby steps forward, eyes narrowed. "What's she laughing at?" she mutters under her breath, her voice rising with suspicion. There's no cause for laughter in this world, not for her, not with what she's been through, and certainly not alone. A few other villagers murmur in agreement, but none of them dare to speak directly to the widow. Instead, they turn to Father Gregory, who is standing at the edge of the group, observing with an air of quiet authority. Father Gregory is a man who has spent his life guarding the souls of the people in his care, and he knows that laughter, especially when it is unprovoked, can be a sign of something far darker than simple amusement. He approaches the widow, his steps heavy on the muddy earth, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of concern and apprehension. The village is silent as he speaks. "Marjorie," Father Gregory says softly, his voice measured but firm. "What is this laughter, child? Tell me what brings such joy to your heart in a time like this." Marjorie looks up, startled, as if she has been caught in the act of something shameful. Her eyes, wide with uncertainty, flicker briefly with embarrassment before she speaks. "I don't know, Father. I thought of something from before." She trails off, unable to finish her sentence, unsure of how to explain herself. Father Gregory's eyes narrow slightly as he listens, his hand tightening around his rosary. "A thought, you say?" He repeats, his tone heavy with suspicion. "A thought that caused you to laugh without cause or reason." The widow nods, her face flushed, but the priest's gaze does not soften. The laughter has unsettled him. It was too spontaneous, too carefree, and in a world where every thought was expected to be controlled and every emotion scrutinized, the idea of someone laughing without cause, without witness, was more than a sign of errant behavior. It was a sign of spiritual imbalance. And to the medieval clergy, spiritual imbalance was a direct invitation for demonic forces to take root. You know, Marjorie, Father Gregory continues, his voice growing sterner. Laughter in the absence of joy is not normal. It is a sign of spiritual weakness, of something corrupting your soul. I fear the devil may have found his way into your heart, using your mind to play tricks on you. At this, a murmur of agreement ripples through the gathered crowd. The villagers' faces grow somber. To them, Father Gregory's words are not just an observation, they are a warning. They all know the dangers of spiritual corruption. A child could be saved with holy water and prayer. An adult, however, was far more dangerous. Their minds were already grown, and the devil could use that maturity to lure them away from salvation. Father Gregory continues, his voice taking on an almost ritualistic quality. This laughter, child, it's a form of possession, a sign that something has entered your mind and is making mockery of your grief. It must be dealt with before it spreads. The widow, her face pale, trembles slightly under his gaze. The villagers, who had been watching in silent judgment, now turn away, casting wary glances over their shoulders. The energy in the square shifts from curiosity to fear. No one wants to be caught in the same trap as the widow. Laughter, they now know, is not to be taken lightly. Father Gregory nods solemnly. We will perform the cleansing, Marjorie. You must be rid of this ailment for your soul's safety. It is not enough to mourn, not enough to feel sorrow. But joy, that is dangerous. That is the work of dark forces. The widow stumbles backward, eyes wide with fear. But Father, she protests, her voice quivering. It was just a laugh. It wasn't. No more words, Father Gregory interjects sharply. We will not allow this to fester. You are not the first to fall into this trap, and you will not be the last. The devil has a way of using laughter to gain a foothold in the soul. It starts small, but left unchecked, it grows. This will be seen to, and you will be made pure again. The widow's shoulders sag, the weight of his words sinking in, and the villagers turn their faces away, some muttering prayers under their breath. They have seen this before. They know how it ends. Father Gregory leads Marjorie back to her cottage, his hand firmly placed on her trembling shoulder. The villagers watch from a distance, the unease lingering in the air like smoke. Laughter, they now know, is a dangerous thing, especially if it is not shared, if it is not understood, if it comes from a place too dark to fathom. The sky, clouded with the weight of impending rain, cast an oppressive gloom over the small medieval village. The sun, rarely seen through the thick fog of the northern landscape, seemed forever on the edge of retreat, its pale light barely making it past the dense clouds. Life here was hard, the soil unforgiving, the seasons unpredictable, and every day was a battle against hunger, illness, and the creeping hand of death that seemed always to be lurking at the edges of existence. Yet despite the overwhelming hardships that tied the villagers to the earth like iron chains, there were still moments when the human spirit, in its quiet rebellion against the daily grind, would show itself. One such moment occurred in the heart of the village, in the shadow of the ancient stone church, where the cries of a woman echoed through the cobbled streets. Eliza, a widow of perhaps 30 winters, had lost her husband to the plague mere months earlier. Her children were young, barely old enough to to understand the finality of death, their innocent faces still untouched by the grimness of the world. She had spent those months attempting to keep her household together, tending to the small vegetable patch behind her cottage, drawing water from the village well, and weaving simple cloth to trade for what little food she could not grow herself. But the grief, as it often does, seeped into her bones, wrapping itself around her heart like a tightening noose. And there were days when even the simplest task seemed impossible. Still, Eliza persisted. Until that fateful morning, when a tear, silent and inexplicable, slipped down her cheek as she scrubbed the floor of her modest cottage. The tears came without warning, an uncontrollable release of sorrow, an overwhelming surge of emotion that was impossible to explain. It was not the grief of her husband's death that stirred her, nor the fear of an uncertain future. It was not the exhaustion of motherhood or the burden of survival. It was simply a moment when the world seemed too much, and her soul, at once fragile and defiant, cracked under the pressure. Eliza wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to make sense of the tears. What was this? Why had it happened? There was no specific reason, no immediate trigger that could explain the outpouring. It was as though her very being had decided to spill itself out onto the floor, leaving behind an unspoken weight of sorrow that she could not comprehend. But in the medieval world, such tears, this crying for no reason, was not viewed with sympathy or understanding. It was not seen as a natural response to the crushing hardships of life. No, to the eyes of the villagers, to the ears of the clergy who walked the streets with heavy steps, unexplainable tears were a symptom of something far darker, something unnatural, a disturbance in the soul, a crack in the very fabric of one's spiritual integrity. As Eliza continued to weep, the old woman who lived across the lane, who had known more than her share of loss in her own time, watched from the small window of her cottage. She saw the grief in Eliza's eyes, but she also saw the unexplainable nature of the tears, tears that had no source. And in the heavy silence that followed, a shiver of dread passed through her. There was something wrong, something that could not be ignored. The woman with her back slightly hunched from years of bending over hearths and washing clothes shuffled to the door. She had seen this before, though it had been many years since she'd had to intervene. Her mind raced to the well-known knowledge passed down from village to village, from priest to priest. Crying without cause was a sign of spiritual illness. It was a clear sign that the soul was leaking its essence into the air, opening itself to demonic influence. And when the soul began to leak, the demons lurking just beyond the veil of human perception would slip in unnoticed. With the purpose of someone accustomed to such tasks, the old woman made her way to the church where she knew Father Gregory would be tending to his midday prayers. His presence was a comfort, but his wisdom was a necessity for the village. There was no time to waste. Father Gregory was already at the altar, his voice low in prayer, as Eliza's sobs echoed faintly through the village. The priest had long known that the life of a medieval villager was fraught with struggle, pain, loss, hardship, and that in these times It was all too common for the mind to slip to falter under the weight of such burdens. Yet it was also his solemn duty to watch over the souls of his flock, to ensure that they did not fall prey to the forces of darkness that haunted the world just out of sight. When the old woman arrived, she did not need to say much. She only nodded toward Eliza's cottage, her face grave. Father Gregory, with the sharp intuition of one who had long seen the signs of spiritual decay, immediately understood. His expression darkened, and he nodded solemnly, his hand tightening around his rosary. He knew what needed to be done. The demons had already begun their work. Without a word, they walked to Eliza's cottage together, Sharona. When they arrived, the door was ajar, and the sound of her weeping filled the air. Father Gregory stepped inside, the old woman trailing behind him. The moment Eliza saw the priest, the tears stopped, though the pain remained. She looked at him, her eyes wide with shame. She knew what this meant. She had heard the whispers in the village. She had heard the stories of others who had cried in secret only to find themselves subject to the scrutiny of the clergy. She had heard of the interventions, the exorcisms, the prayers, the rituals. "Father," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I don't understand it. I wasn't thinking of anything. I wasn't mourning him again. I don't know why." Father Gregory stepped forward, placing his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, yet compassionate. "It is not for you to understand, child. It is not your fault, but your soul is disturbed, and it must be purified." The old woman watched in silence as the priest began his rituals. He spoke the prayers of purification, calling on the power of the saints to cleanse Eliza's spirit and to cast out the unseen forces that had taken root in her mind. The room filled with the scent of incense and the soft, rhythmic cadence of Father Gregory's voice. It was both soothing and terrifying, for Eliza knew that in this act of purification, she was not just being cleansed of her sorrow. She was being exorcised of something far darker. The ritual was not just about the soul. It was about restoring balance, about making sure that the cracks in one's spirit were sealed before they could be exploited. Crying like laughter or wandering thoughts was not seen as a simple emotional outpouring. It was a spiritual failure. It meant that the soul was vulnerable to attack. In medieval Europe, the mind was not a sanctuary to be entered freely. It was a battleground. And in a world where the devil was ever present, waiting for even the slightest crack, emotional responses had to be closely monitored. There was no room for weakness, no room for spontaneous feeling. Each tear, each laugh, each moment of silent contemplation had the potential to open a door to the supernatural world. When the ritual was finished and Eliza had been bathed in holy water, she felt both exhausted and lighter. She knew the burden was not fully lifted, that it would return perhaps in different forms. She had been given no answers, only the belief that the demons had been cast out for now. The rest she would carry with her, waiting for another crack, another leak in her soul. It was never truly over. As Father Gregory and the old woman left the village outside, seemed unchanged. The wind still howled, the rain still fell. Life continued as it always did. Yet for Eliza, something had shifted. She would never be the same, and neither would the villagers. They would watch her as they had watched so many before her to see if the cracks would return. The fear, as always, was that one day it might be too late. In the medieval village, where every face was a familiar one and every conversation was a potential source of gossip, the very idea of privacy was as foreign as the distant stars in the night sky. People lived together, worked together, and suffered together, their lives bound by the unrelenting rhythms of communal existence. The cottage doors were rarely closed, and if they were, it wasn't because someone sought solitude, but because a family had gone to sleep, or a widow had drawn the curtains to shield herself from the prying eyes of the village. Privacy was not something to be desired. It was a luxury reserved for the powerful or the dead. For the common folk, it was both an unnatural desire and a social transgression. Imagine this: a man weary from a day of toiling in the fields comes home to his modest cottage. He has worked from dawn until dusk, his muscles sore, his mind clouded by the constant grind of survival. The day has been long, the work monotonous, and now, as the evening settles in, all he wants is a moment to himself. Perhaps he sits in the corner of the room, away from the chatter of his wife and children, hoping for a moment of quiet reflection. Maybe he needs to clear his mind, to rest, to simply be alone with his thoughts. In a world that constantly demanded something from him, his labor, his attention, his energy, he craves nothing more than a fleeting sense of peace. But in a medieval world that viewed communal living as essential to both survival and spiritual salvation, his desire for solitude is seen as something much darker. It is not merely an act of personal preference. It is a sign of something amiss, something dangerous. To want privacy, to seek solitude, was to separate oneself from the group, to step outside the collective human experience, and that was a breach of the natural order. The village was not just a place for physical proximity. It was a reflection of the divine order of things. And solitude, true solitude, was a rebellion against that order. The villagers knew this instinctively. They had grown up in a world where every moment of life was a shared experience, where even grief, joy, and personal reflection had no true private space. The boundaries of personal life were porous, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Secrets were not kept. They were shared, whether willingly or not. To live outside that communal flow was to risk becoming something other, something disconnected from the divine circle that held everything together. And so, when the man retreats to his corner, when he pulls away from his family and seeks a brief respite in silence, there is a pause, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the village's energy. Those who notice him, those who see him withdraw, begin to wonder, why does he want to be alone? What is he hiding? Is there something wrong with him? A woman passing by the cottage on her way to the market notices the door is closed. She glances toward the window, half expecting to see the man working in his garden or tending to his children. But no, the silence is unnerving. He is not at work. He is not with his family. He is inside alone. Her steps slow as she watches the cottage, her mind already beginning to work. She knows the rules. and she knows the consequences of stepping outside them. There are whispers in the village about those who seek too much solitude, about those who desire privacy and cannot explain why. They are the ones who are different, and in the medieval world, different was dangerous. The woman hurries past the cottage, her mind spinning with possibilities. She had seen the man in church just last Sunday, his eyes cast downward, his lips moving in a way that seemed unnaturally calm, or perhaps too absorbed in his thoughts, too focused on himself. He had been distant, distracted, not present, and now he's alone in his cottage, withdrawing from his family, from the world. Could it be? Could he be? The thought hangs in the air, unspoken but heavy. She quickens her pace, the shadows of suspicion already creeping into her heart. That night, as the man lies in bed, trying to quiet his racing mind, he hears a soft knock at the door. At first he thinks it's the wind, but then he hears it again, more insistent this time. Slowly, he rises from his bed and opens the door to find two figures standing before him. The village priest, Father Gregory, and a neighbor woman who has come to voice her concerns. The priest looks at him with an expression that holds neither malice nor kindness, only duty. His eyes are dark measuring. "Good evening," Father Gregory says, his voice low and steady. "We have come to speak with you." The man is confused, disoriented by the suddenness of the visit. "Speak with me. What is this about?" The priest's gaze doesn't soften. "It has come to our attention that you have been seeking solitude. You have closed yourself off from your family. This is not the way of things. It is not the way of God." The neighbor woman steps forward, her voice trembling slightly. "We are concerned, Thomas. You are a good man, but we have noticed your withdrawal. We saw you retreating today, not joining in with the others. The silence, it feels unnatural." The man stands there in silence, his mind racing. He wants to explain himself, to tell them he is merely tired, worn out by the demands of his life. He wants to tell them he sought nothing more than a moment of peace, a quiet breath, before the endless cycle of labor began again. But he knows instinctively that such an explanation will not suffice. Father Gregory steps closer, his expression hardening. Solitude is a luxury for those who can afford it. It is for the rich and the powerful, for those whose lives are unburdened by the weight of responsibility. But for you, Thomas, no. You are part of the village. You are part of the community. To seek isolation is to pull away from God's plan. It is a sin. The man feels his chest tighten. He had not thought of it this way. He had not realized that wanting privacy, wanting peace, was in itself a transgression. And yet, here it was, a clear accusation, a charge laid against him. He had sought solitude, and in doing so, he had set himself apart from the very fabric of the world around him. It is not for you to decide when you are alone. Thomas the priest continues, his voice firm. We all share in the burdens of life. We all suffer. We all work. We all endure. But we do not turn inward. We do not look away from one another. If you wish to be alone, you are no better than the witches of old those who lived in seclusion, who called upon spirits from the other world. The man's heart sinks. Witchcraft. The accusation hovers above him like a dark cloud. To be alone is to invite the suspicion of the villagers of the clergy. To withdraw is to mark oneself as different, as suspicious. A desire for privacy is a signal that something is wrong. And in the eyes of medieval society, there was no greater crime than a refusal to conform. Father Gregory steps back, his gaze fixed. We will pray for you, Thomas. You must repent for your desire for privacy. It is a sign of weakness, of corruption. You must be cleansed for the safety of your soul. The neighbor woman nods in agreement, her face drawn with concern. We are only looking out for you, Thomas. You must not turn away from the light. You must remain with us always. With that, they leave him standing in the doorway, his mind a swirl of confusion and fear. He looks at the empty, quiet cottage, now filled with the weight of their words. He knows that his desire for solitude, a simple human need for a moment's peace, has been interpreted as a sin, as a signal that he has fallen away from the path. And he wonders what other parts of his soul have been found wanting. What other simple desires will be twisted into something dark and sinister? What part of him will be next? The walls of his home seem to close in around him. The silence feels heavier now. The desire for solitude has become a dangerous thing. He has invited suspicion, and now it is his to bear. There is no place for privacy in a world where every soul is watched, every gesture measured. In the medieval village, privacy is a luxury only the powerful can afford. And for the rest of them, the very act of seeking it means they are no longer fully human. They are something else, something dangerous. The cold, thick silence of the medieval night was like a blanket that covered the world in its stillness. The moon, pale and distant, cast long shadows across the dirt-packed streets and thatched roofs of the village, its light struggling to pierce through the clouds. Inside the modest cottages, flickering flames from hearths illuminated tired faces huddled around small tables or sitting on straw-filled beds. It was a world that, while locked in perpetual hardship, also carried with it the very rhythm of survival, a rhythm deeply tied to the land, to the seasons, and to the divine order of things. In this world, sleep was a complicated affair. It was not simply the natural act of resting one's body after a long day's labor, nor was it seen as the necessary escape from the burden of waking consciousness. No. In the medieval mindset, sleep was a battle, a confrontation between the living soul and the forces that surrounded it. The act of sleep was intertwined with the spiritual journey of the individual. It was a time when the body was most vulnerable to the supernatural, when the thin veil between the earthly and the otherworldly could be breached by demonic forces or restless spirits. Imagine then a weary medieval villager, exhausted from a day's work, in the fields returning home to their small, dimly lit hut. The fire has nearly burned out the last flickers of flame, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls. The man or woman whose muscles ache and whose mind spins with thoughts of the day's struggles lies down on a bed of straw, hoping for a few hours of rest before the sun rises again. But in this world, the act of sleep was far from simple. For the medieval villager's sleep was not just a biological necessity, it was a matter of spiritual concern. The time spent in the darkness of sleep was a time when the soul was most vulnerable. It was a time when demons could slip in unnoticed, when the body might be invaded by spirits or the devil himself. And in a time where every aspect of life was under constant scrutiny, the very act of sleeping became a spiritual battleground. It was during this time, while lying still in the depths of night, that the village priest or the wise elder would advise on the proper sleep schedule. Sleep to the medieval mind was not just about resting. It was about maintaining the delicate balance between the mortal world and the supernatural one. Too much sleep, and you risked inviting demonic forces into your body. Too little, and you were seen as spiritually compromised, as if the restless mind was being tormented by dark forces beyond your control. There was no safe middle ground, no healthy indulgence in a brief moment of rest. Instead, everything about sleep was carefully dictated by the spiritual rhythms of the time. The villagers were keenly aware of the rules that governed sleep, and violations of these rules could lead to suspicion, accusations, or worse. Sleep was meant to align with the rising and setting of the sun. It was not for indulgence or pleasure. Sleep should be simple and regulated like every other aspect of medieval life. To sleep too long was to invite demonic possession, while insomnia, the inability to rest, was a far more terrifying sign of spiritual warfare. Father Gregory, the priest who ruled over the spiritual health of the village, often found himself at the center of these fears. It was he who would be called upon if someone fell ill after a long period of restless nights, or if someone had been reported to sleep too much, too deeply, too long. These were dangerous sign signals that the soul had strayed from its divine purpose, that the mind had become a playground for supernatural forces. One evening, as Father Gregory walked through the village after Vespers, his heavy cloak dragging behind him, he came upon a small cottage where the door was ajar. He had heard whispers of trouble inside. The villagers had noticed that Abelard, a young farmer, had been sleeping excessively over the past few days, never rising with the sun, always lying in his bed, long after the roosters crow. His behavior had drawn the attention of his neighbors, who were already concerned about his pale face and gaunt features. Father Gregory knocked on the door, his hand heavy on the rough wood. "Abelard, are you there?" His voice, deep and commanding, resonated within the stillness of the cottage. Abelard, sluggish from sleep, finally emerged, his eyes red and bleary. "Father, what brings you here?" he asked, his voice weak, almost hollow. Father Gregory stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and stale straw. "I have come to speak with you about your sleep, Abelard. It has come to my attention that you sleep too much, too deeply. This is unnatural. It is a sign that your soul is at risk." Abelard winced, as though struck by the weight of the priest's words. "Father, he began, but the priest raised a hand to silence him. "You are opening yourself to dangerous forces, Abelard. Too much sleep is a sign that demons are at work. The body is meant to rest, yes, but only as the Creator intended. There is no reason for you to fall into such a deep slumber, such a long rest. What is it that troubles you?" Have you been visited in the night? Abelard shook his head, his mind cloudy with confusion. I have been tired, Father. The work is exhausting, and the world is heavy. My dreams are restless, but I do not remember them. Father Gregory's brow furrowed. Restless dreams. That is a troubling sign. We must cleanse your soul of these disturbances. There is something that seeks to enter through the cracks in your mind. Abelard looked away, his gaze sinking to the floor. I have not been able to sleep in peace for many nights. I hear things, whispers in the dark, voices that call to me, urging me to follow. Father Gregory's face turned grim. Whispers, you say? He asked, his voice low and measured. That is no ordinary sleep disturbance. It is a sign that demons are attempting to take hold of you. We must act quickly. Father Gregory placed his hands on Abelard's shoulders, his grip firm and sure. You must not allow this spirit to possess you. You must purge yourself of these unholy thoughts. I will perform a cleansing ritual. We will pray, and you will rid yourself of this curse. Do you understand? Abelard nodded slowly, his eyes wide with fear. He had heard the stories of people who had fallen under the influence of demons during their sleep, who had become mindless puppets for evil forces. He did not want to be one of those people. Father Gregory instructed Abelard to kneel before him, his hands raised in prayer. The ritual began, the words flowing from the priest's lips like a chant. He called upon the saints, the angels, and the power of God to expel the demons that had entered Abelard's dreams. The room seemed to darken with the weight of the ritual, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the spiritual forces to battle. For hours, Father Gregory prayed, his voice unwavering. And at last, as the first light of dawn began to break through the small window of Abelard's cottage, there was a stillness, a peaceful calm that washed over the room. Abelard, though exhausted, felt the weight of the oppressive presence lift. The whispers, the voices were gone. He looked up at Father Gregory, his eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. Your soul has been cleansed, Abelard, the priest said softly. But remember, you must rise with the sun. Sleep is a gift, but it is also a battleground. Do not allow your rest to become an invitation for the devil to enter your heart. Abelard nodded, his breath shallow but steady. He understood now. His desire for too much sleep, his prolonged rest, had been a dangerous thing. It was not a simple need for rejuvenation. It was a sign of spiritual weakness. The demons had come for him, and had he not been purged, he might have lost more than just his dreams. He might have lost himself. As Father Gregory left the cottage, he felt the weight of his actions settling within him. The ritual had worked, but it was only one small victory in a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was drawn so tenuously. Sleep, to the medieval mind, was a double-edged sword. It was both a gift and a trap. It was a necessity, yes, but it could also be the doorway to evil if one was not careful. The people of the village, as they went about their daily tasks, were constantly reminded of this delicate balance. The rising and setting of the sun governed not only their labor, but their very souls. the times when they slept too much or not at all, were fraught with danger, the threat of unseen forces ever present. There was no room for deviation. To sleep too long meant the intrusion of demons. To sleep too little meant spiritual fatigue and susceptibility. And so, the villagers walked the tightrope of divine order, their minds and bodies caught between the demands of the world and the ever-looming threat of supernatural forces. For Abelard, the lesson had been a hard one, but it was one he would carry with him for the rest of his days. Sleep in the medieval world was never just sleep. It was always a spiritual battle, a struggle for control over the body and soul, a fight that continued silently every night when the rest of the world lay in slumber. In a world where life was a constant struggle for survival, joy stood as a glaring aberration. The medieval world was not one for comfort, and certainly not one for ease. Suffering was the currency of life, and misery, with its heavy hand, shaped the very contours of existence. The cold winds, the endless labor, the pestilence, the hunger, all of it was endured, not to be overcome, but to be lived with, day by day, hour by hour. To feel joy, to experience happiness in the face of such overwhelming hardship, was seen as not just improbable, but downright dangerous. Imagine the village square on any given day. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and animal refuse. Children, their faces streaked with dirt, run through the streets barefoot and unprotected from the biting chill. Farmers toil in the fields, their backs bent from endless hours of work, beneath a sun that never shines bright enough to offer relief. Even the animals seem resigned to their existence, dragging their tired hooves through the muck, bleating, lowing, or crowing in monotone rhythms that mirror the exhaustion of the village itself. The world hums with the dull ache of survival. In this world, joy was a rare commodity, almost a foreign concept. It was the kind of emotion that could be enjoyed only in small, fleeting moments, when the weather was kind, when a child laughed for a reason unknown, or when perhaps a meal was shared in warmth and relative abundance. Yet even these brief flashes of happiness carried with them a weight of suspicion. What was the cause of this unnatural feeling? Was it not written that man was born into suffering? Was it not understood that the life of a Christian was meant to be one of sacrifice, penance, and toil? And yet there was always someone who dared to smile a little too widely, who laughed when the world demanded silence, who danced when the world required stillness. To those who dared to express joy, the response was swift and certain suspicion. Take, for example, the story of Margaret, a woman who lived on the outskirts of the village. She was known for her hard work, her unrelenting spirit. Every day, she would wake before the sun and work until it dipped below the horizon. But unlike most villagers, she would whistle as she worked. She would hum a tune under her breath, a light melody that seemed to echo above the heavy silence that typically blanketed the village. Sometimes she even laughed, her voice ringing out through the fields. Her laughter, sweet and genuine, seemed out of place against the backdrop of hardship. And that, of course, was what made it so dangerous. Margaret's neighbors began to take notice of her strange behavior. At first, it was a whisper here and there, a remark made in passing. "Did you hear her laugh?" one woman would say. It was strange, like the birds singing out of season. "She's too happy," another might add. "There's something wrong with her." And the whispers grew, spreading like wildfire through the village. Soon the rumors began to twist, mutating into something darker. "She must be in league with the devil." One elder declared, his voice heavy with certainty. "No one is that happy in this world. It is a sign of corruption." The village priest, Father Gregory, heard the gossip, and his gaze grew cold with suspicion. He had seen this kind of thing before in other villages. Joy in his mind was not a gift. It was a temptation, a snare laid by the devil to lead the faithful astray. For joy to appear in a world so steeped in suffering could only mean one thing: that the person experiencing it had abandoned the path of righteousness, had opened themselves to the dark influences that sought to lure men and women away from God's will. And so, one day, Father Gregory visited Margaret's cottage. The village had already begun to speak of her joy, her smiles, her laughter, and the priest was not one to ignore the whispers of the people. He knocked on her door, his heavy boots echoing against the cobblestones. Margaret opened it, her face glowing with warmth, her eyes shining with something the priest could not quite place. "Good morning, Father," she said, a soft smile gracing her lips. Father Gregory's gaze narrowed. "Good morning, Margaret," he replied stiffly. "I have come to speak with you about something troubling." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, but she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Of course, Father. Please come in." Once inside, Father Gregory took a seat at the small wooden table near the hearth. He folded his hands in front of him, his voice heavy with authority. "Margaret, it has come to my attention that you have been behaving strangely. You have been laughing, humming, smiling. You are too joyful, too full of happiness. Tell me, what is the cause of it?" Margaret, taken aback by his words, shifted uncomfortably. "Father, there is no cause for concern. I simply enjoy life despite the hardships we face. Life is hard, yes, but it is also a gift. We must find joy where we can." Father Gregory's lips tightened into a thin line. "Finding joy, you say? Is that what you call it?" His voice rose slightly, as though he was struggling to keep his temper in check. "Do you not know that happiness is a gift from the devil? That joy, especially in times like these, is a temptation, a lure that seeks to pull you away from your duties to God." Margaret stared at him confused. "Father, I do not understand. How can joy be a temptation? Is it not something that we are meant to feel even in the smallest moments?" Father Gregory stood up suddenly, his face flushed with anger. "You think you are above the natural order, do you? That you can simply ignore the suffering that is our lot in this world and bask in your own happiness? No. This is a sign of weakness, Margaret. This is a sign that something evil has taken hold of you. You are in league with dark forces, and if you do not renounce your ways, I will have no choice but to bring you before the village. You will be cleansed. You will be made right again." Margaret felt the weight of his words fall upon her like a crushing stone. She had never thought of her joy in such terms. She had simply laughed, simply smiled, simply allowed herself a few moments of peace in a world that often offered none. But now, standing before the priest, she understood that in this world, peace was not a right. It was a danger. The next day, the priest gathered the village elders. He called for an intervention. Margaret was to be tested. Her joy was too much to ignore, too much to allow. They would pray for her. They would cleanse her of the unholy influences that had taken root in her heart. The villagers gathered in the town square, their faces twisted with a mixture of fear and fascination. They watched as Father Gregory led Margaret to the center, his voice raised in a prayer that echoed through the square. Margaret stood there, her heart heavy with confusion. Her joy, her laughter, the very essence of who she was, had become something unnatural in the eyes of the village. It had become a mark of suspicion, a sign that she had strayed too far from the divine order. And as Father Gregory continued his chanting as the villagers gathered around her, she wondered, was it really joy that had made her different? Or was it simply the fact that she had dared to feel it at all? The event would become a turning point for Margaret, for the village, and for Father Gregory himself. The villagers, shaken by the experience, began to whisper among themselves even more. Some of them wondered if joy was really such a sin after all. Others, however, took the priest's words to heart, their fears growing stronger with each passing day. Margaret never quite recovered from the public trial. The joy that once filled her heart, that had once been her armor against the harshness of life, became something she hid away. She smiled less, laughed less, and kept her thoughts to herself. The fear of suspicion had worked its way into her soul, a permanent shadow cast over her once bright spirit. She had learned the lesson that medieval Europe taught so well: happiness was not a gift to be embraced. It was a threat to be quashed. And in the years that followed, the village would return to its usual quiet suffering, its people silently enduring the hardships of life, their hearts heavy but in line with the natural order. But Margaret, for all her efforts to blend in, would never fully be the same. Her joy had been branded as unnatural, and now, like so many others, she carried the weight of suspicion with her every waking moment. For joy in the medieval world was not a blessing. It was a red flag, a danger, an invitation for scrutiny. In the bleak and unforgiving landscape of medieval Europe, where the cold seemed to creep into every corner of life, music was a rare but treasured escape. However, it was not the kind of private indulgence that we often associate with music today. In the medieval mindset, music was never to be enjoyed in solitude. It was a communal experience, something shared in the presence of others, bound together in ritual and social necessity. To play an instrument alone, to hum a tune while working in the fields, or to listen to music without the company of others was not just a sign of isolation. It was a spiritual transgression. It was an invitation for demons to slip inside a gateway through which the soul could be possessed. The medieval worldview was one steeped in the belief that everything had a purpose. Everything was connected to the divine order. Music, for all its beauty, was no exception. It had a place in the public square in the church, at celebrations, or during collective prayer. It was a means of connecting with others, of raising one's voice in unison or offering praise to God. But the moment music was experienced in private, it was seen as dangerous, as a solitary pleasure that opened the door to unseen forces beyond the control of the individual. Imagine for a moment the quiet stillness of a village after the sun has set. The streets are dimly lit by flickering torches, casting long shadows across the narrow cobblestones. The villagers are settling in for the night, the heavy exhaustion of a day spent laboring in the fields weighing on their limbs. The soft hum of distant chatter and the occasional clink of metal echo in the cold air. But within the warmth of a humble cottage, something unusual stirs. A man weary and seeking a moment of respite from the burdens of his daily life begins to hum a quiet melody. It is a tune he remembers from his youth, a song of simpler times before the weight of the world had pressed down on him. His voice is low, almost imperceptible, but the melody lingers in the air. To the outside observer, this moment may seem innocent enough. Perhaps it is even seen as a brief, private indulgence in an otherwise harsh existence. But in the medieval world, this act would not have been seen as peaceful or private. It would have been a cry for help. For the moment he lifted his voice, even in that gentle hum, he invited the world's darkest forces into his home. The melody, which was once a symbol of joy, of shared experience, had now become a dangerous act, a call to the unknown. Music in this context was not just a means of expression. It was a powerful living force, and its vibrations were believed to have the potential to draw in the supernatural. In medieval Europe, there was little distinction between earthly and unearthly. The same music that brought people together during feasts or church services was just as capable of summoning demons or unseen spirits when played in solitude. For what could be more private, more dangerous than a soul-seeking comfort in music? The villagers who passed by the cottage and heard the faint hum would not have considered it a private moment of relaxation. They would have stopped in their tracks, listening intently, their faces drawn with suspicion. "What is he doing?" they might have whispered. "Does he not know what he invites when he sings alone?" The question would have been asked in hushed tones, but it would have been clear the man was not simply humming a song. He was engaging in a ritual one that had no witnesses and no boundaries. And that in the medieval view was enough to seal his fate. Father Gregory, the priest of the village, would have been the first to hear the whispers about this man and his private music. Gregory had been taught from an early age that music, especially when sung or played without company, was a dangerous indulgence. The mind, in its weak and fragile state, could easily slip into spiritual corruption when left unchecked. And the temptation of music, of sound, was one that could unmoor the soul from the safety of the earthly realm, pulling it into realms unknown, into the grasp of evil forces. Father Gregory knew that such private expressions of music were not to be tolerated. It was not just the melody that was problematic, but the very act of self-indulgence. Music should never be an escape from suffering. It should never be a refuge in solitude. It was a communal practice, a ritualistic experience meant to bind people together in shared suffering and shared joy. And so, one evening, Father Gregory made his way to the man's cottage. The air was thick with the chill of winter, and the ground was slick with frost. He could hear the faint strains of music from inside echoing through the thin walls. As he knocked on the door, the music faltered and the man opened the door, his face pale and drawn from days of labor and sleepless nights. "Father," the man said, standing back to let him enter. "What brings you here this evening?" Gregory's eyes narrowed as he stepped inside. "I have come to speak with you, my son," he began, his voice cold. "I have heard of your humming. It is not appropriate. Music when sung alone is a dangerous thing. It invites forces from beyond this world to enter your soul." The man looked confused, but the priest continued, his voice growing more stern. "It is not for the ears of the living to hear, alone in the silence of your home. You think it harmless, but you are wrong. You are allowing the demons into your mind. You are summoning them with your very voice." The man's face grew pale. "I did not mean harm, Father. It was only a song, a memory from my youth. I did not mean to offend or invite evil." Gregory's expression hardened. "The devil is patient," he said, stepping closer, "and he does not wait for an invitation. He waits for moments like this, moments of solitude, of weakness. Music alone is a doorway, and you, my son, have opened it." The man looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping with the weight of the priest's words. He had only sought a brief respite from the crushing weight of his life. But now, in the presence of Father Gregory, he understood that his small, innocent act had drawn the attention of something much darker. The warmth of the fire, the quiet of his own mind, had all become dangerous. In this world, there was no room for private comfort, for solitude. There was only the collective suffering that bound the village together, and the music that accompanied it. Gregory placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You must renounce this music," he said softly. "You must cleanse your soul of this temptation. We will pray together, and we will drive the demons from you. You will be saved, but you must never again give in to the desire to sing alone, to indulge in music for yourself." The man nodded slowly, fear creeping into his chest. He knew that he was not the only one who had sought comfort in music and solitary pleasures. There were others, surely, who had felt the same temptation. But to be caught, to be marked by the priest's intervention, was a fate he could not bear. And so the man joined Father Gregory in prayer, his voice trembling as he repeated the words of the priest's chant. He prayed for forgiveness, for protection, for release from the evil that had entered his home. The music, once a source of solace, had now become his greatest enemy. Outside the cottage, the village was silent, save for the distant howl of the wind and the low murmur of voices. No one would know what had transpired inside. The man's private struggle had remained hidden from the world, but the suspicion lingered. The villagers would continue to wonder, whispering behind closed doors. And the next time they heard a faint tune, they would remember the danger it carried. For in the medieval world, music, like every other act of personal indulgence, was never innocent. It was always a reflection of something far more sinister, something that had no place in the everyday humble life of a peasant. Music, in the eyes of the medieval world, was not a simple pleasure. It was a force, a dangerous one, capable of unearthing the deepest fears, desires, and darkest temptations of the soul. And for those who dared to experience it alone, the consequences were far greater than the fleeting joy it brought. It could cost them their very souls. The fall of night in medieval Europe was not merely the dimming of the sky, but the beginning of a transformation. A shift from the familiar, orderly world of daylight into a realm where the rules of nature no longer applied. As the sun sank beneath the horizon and the darkness spread across the land, the village once alive with the sounds of daily labor fell silent. The once bustling streets now became eerie, empty pathways, and the flickering of oil lamps was the only sign of life in a world now ruled by shadows. In the medieval mind, night was more than just a time for rest. It was a perilous period, a liminal space where the boundaries between the human world and the supernatural thinned. With the absence of daylight, the veil between the living and the dead, between good and evil, was believed to grow dangerously thin. Demon spirits and all manner of unseen forces were thought to roam freely under the cover of night, waiting for the unwary to stumble into their grasp. It was a time when the supernatural seemed to stretch its long ethereal fingers into the lives of the living. The village was not simply a collection of homes. It was a place under constant siege, not by marauding bands or wild beasts, but by the very forces of darkness itself. To be caught outside after dark, to venture alone into the night, was a grave risk. In this world, the night was not merely a time for sleep. It was a time when madness could creep in unnoticed, when the soul could be ensnared by forces beyond comprehension. Imagine walking through the village square, late in the evening, the air thick with the chill of impending winter. The lamplights cast faint pools of light on the ground, offering little comfort against the overwhelming darkness that surrounded you. The village, once vibrant, now seems unnaturally still. Even the sound of footsteps, once a common accompaniment to everyday life, now feels foreign and unsettling, echoing unnervingly in the empty streets. You, a villager accustomed to the rhythms of the day, now feel the weight of the night pressing in on you, as though it were a living, breathing entity. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and for a fleeting moment, you wonder if you are truly alone. It was in these quiet moments, these rare instances, when the darkness seemed to swallow the world whole, that the medieval villagers felt the first stirrings of paranoia. A single footstep at the edge of the village might be the sound of a spirit, a wandering soul from the afterlife seeking a way back into the world of the living. A shadow moving against the grain of the night could be a demon, one of many that had been set loose by the failing light. The unknown was amplified at night, and the villagers had no choice but to fear it. Night was the domain of spirits of witches and of darker, far more malevolent entities. One of the most commonly held beliefs was that the witching hour, the period between dusk and midnight, was when the gates of hell were most easily opened. It was said that the devil himself roamed the earth during these hours, calling forth his minions to wreak havoc upon the unsuspecting. Even the most devout priests, those who had spent their days in quiet reflection, could be heard muttering prayers before they ventured outside after nightfall. To do so without proper protection, without the shield of the Lord, was to court disaster. And yet, there were always those who dared to venture outside despite the warnings. They were not the bold or the foolish. They were the ones who, for reasons of their own, had to face the darkness. Some were travelers too far from their homes to seek shelter before the sun went down. Others, more tragically, were those who had become lost in the depths of despair. wandering the streets, in a daze, unable to escape their own demons. But for all of them, there was one thing they shared in common. They were watched. The moment a villager stepped outside at night, they became the subject of scrutiny. The village had no tolerance for those who wandered into the night. To do so was not simply a sign of erratic behavior, it was a signal that something darker had taken hold. Take, for example, Thomas, a miller who lived just on the outskirts of the village. His routine was simple, predictable: up with the sun, work until dusk, then retreat into the warmth of his home. But one evening, something drove him to leave. Perhaps it was the weight of his thoughts. Perhaps the suffocating silence of his cottage. Whatever the reason, he stepped out into the cold night, walking toward the forest at the edge of the village. It was an innocuous enough action, one that might be brushed aside in any other context, but in medieval Europe, such a simple act carried an enormous weight. As he walked, the villagers watched. Eyes peered out from behind curtains, shadows cast across windows, and whispers spread through the night like wildfire. "Thomas is out there," they would say, "walking in the night." The fear began to spread slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. A man walking alone at night was one thing, but a man wandering the streets without a clear purpose was another matter entirely. It wasn't long before the whispers grew darker. "He's in league with the devil," one neighbor muttered, wringing her hands. Only someone cursed would wander out there in the dead of night. Another villager, her voice barely a whisper, said, "Maybe he's gone mad. There's something unnatural about it. Nobody should be walking out there now, not without a reason." Father Gregory, ever vigilant, wasted no time in investigating. He too had heard the whispers, and like so many others, he believed that Thomas's behavior was a clear sign of something supernatural. It wasn't just the act of walking at night, it was the fact that Thomas had walked into the night at all. Had he not felt the pull of the devil's influence, the strange compulsion to break free of the confines of his home? The night, to Gregory's mind, was the only time such a thing could happen. If Thomas had been caught walking out in the daylight, perhaps the matter could be explained away as a mere folly. But this was something different. It was a disturbance in the natural order, one that demanded intervention. Father Gregory found Thomas wandering near the edge of the village, standing still, as though lost in thought. His expression was vacant, his movements slow and disjointed. The priest's heart sank as he approached him. Thomas Gregory called softly, his voice filled with an edge of concern. "What are you doing out here? Why have you come?" Thomas turned to face him, but there was nothing in his eyes. They were wide and glassy, as though he was seeing something beyond the priest. "I don't know," Thomas replied, his voice a mere rasp. "I was just walking. The night. It calls to me." Father Gregory could feel the weight of his words, the eerie sense of foreboding that had settled in the air. "You must come with me," Thomas the priest said, his tone firm. "There is nothing for you out here, and you are in grave danger. Come back to the village. This is not a time for wandering. The forces of darkness roam freely under the cover of night, and you have already opened yourself to their influence." With those words, Thomas shuddered, but he did not resist as Gregory led him back to the village. The whispers had already begun. What happened to Thomas? Is he mad? Has he been touched by the devil? To the villagers, the mystery of his nighttime walk was clear. He had ventured too far into the darkness, and the darkness had left its mark on him. His mental state was now suspect, and his very act of walking alone in the night became a reflection of the dangerous supernatural forces at play. The idea of night as a realm of danger and darkness did not just stem from the fear of wandering spirits. It was deeply tied to the medieval belief that the soul itself could be compromised in the night. The things that happened during the day, the work, the labor, the interactions could be kept within the bounds of the known world. But when night fell, it was as though the human mind became more vulnerable, more exposed to the malevolent forces that slipped through the cracks of the day. And so, as the years passed, the suspicion surrounding night became more ingrained. Those who were caught wandering alone, who broke the natural law by stepping outside under the cover of darkness, were not simply seen as outcasts. They were seen as individuals who had crossed a threshold that separated the living from the dead, the sane from the insane, the blessed from the cursed. As the shadows lengthened and the world faded into darkness each evening, the villagers of medieval Europe would say a prayer before they closed their doors. They would huddle together, secure in the light, because they knew deep down that the night was not just an absence of day. It was a time for something else, something far older and far more dangerous. For in the medieval world, night was not merely the end of the day. It was the beginning of something far worse, the eternal wandering of the soul in the company of shadows. In the medieval world, knowledge was not just a tool for personal development or a gateway to enlightenment. It was a power, a dangerous one. Reading, particularly for pleasure, was far more than an innocent hobby. It was an act of defiance against the natural order, a silent rebellion against the divine structure that the church sought to uphold. To seek knowledge beyond the sacred texts, to read anything that was not approved by the clergy, was to open oneself up to the possibility of spiritual corruption. It was an invitation for demons to enter the soul, a subtle rebellion that threatened the very fabric of society. The medieval period was one where the written word was an exclusive domain of the church and the aristocracy. The common folk had no access to books, let alone the ability to read them. Only the clergy, the monks, and the elite had the privilege of reading and writing, and even then, it was strictly controlled. The Bible, the cornerstone of medieval Christianity, was the only text deemed worthy of regular reading. Any literature outside of the scriptures was seen with suspicion. The written word, if it ventured into secular matters, could stir ideas that were not just heretical, but potentially diabolical. Knowledge untempered by divine doctrine was seen as the devil's playground. Imagine for a moment the life of a common peasant. You rise with the sun, labor in the fields all day, and return to your humble abode at night, your body aching from the endless toil. You have no time for books, no access to education, no luxury of curiosity. The Bible, of course, is the central fixture in your life. Its teachings are the framework of your existence, the moral compass that guides you through each day. Yet beyond the sacred scriptures, there is no other literature that holds any weight. The only other books you might glimpse are the occasional prayer book or saints' biographies offered to you by the priest or the local scribe. These texts are sacred, and their purpose is clear: to guide you, to remind you of your place in the world, to reinforce your faith, and to help you bear the suffering of your life with grace. Now imagine that in some rare twist of fate, you, a peasant, stumble upon a book that is not approved by the church. Perhaps it is a story of old legends or a tome of classical philosophy, remnants of a time before the church had consolidated its power over knowledge. You cannot read it yourself, of course, not yet. Your literacy is a distant dream, something only a select few could attain. But in the rarest of circumstances, you might learn the letters perhaps through the curiosity of a traveling scholar or a wandering monk. Your newfound literacy brings with it a great temptation. The temptation to read not just what is sacred, but what is forbidden. The moment you begin reading a secular text, the world changes. What once seemed like a harmless pursuit, opening a book out of curiosity, becomes an act of spiritual betrayal. The church had long decreed that only certain forms of knowledge were permissible, and all others were tainted by the devil. Books that delved into secular topics that explored nature philosophy or human experience without the mediation of divine authority were not just frowned upon, they were considered the work of Satan. To read such works was to invite unholy ideas into the mind, ideas that could lead a soul astray. Take the example of a book that had once been in the hands of a well-known scholar, perhaps a treatise on the natural world, a work of ancient philosophy, or a translation of a classical work from the Roman or Greek periods. The very existence of these texts was considered suspicious. The church's position was clear. Any knowledge that was not directly aligned with Christian teachings was a potential doorway for demonic influence. The peasants, with their limited understanding of the dangers that lurked in the world, might not have known just how deeply they had transgressed by even thinking of reading such works. But they knew the power of the church, and they understood, on some primal level, that the written word was not something to be taken lightly. Every line, every word, had the potential to shape the mind, to alter the soul, to disrupt the divine order. If you found yourself drawn to texts that encouraged you to think for yourself, to reason independently of church doctrine, you were not just dabbling in dangerous waters, you were setting sail on a course that could lead to spiritual destruction. Father Gregory, the village priest, knew this all too well. He had been trained in the ways of the church, taught from a young age to fear the knowledge of the unbaptized world. Books outside the canon of church-approved literature were the gateway to heresy, to spiritual corruption. And yet even Gregory knew that the thirst for knowledge was not easily quenched. The human desire to understand the world, to question the divine mysteries, was an eternal temptation, one that had claimed the souls of many before him. The danger of such knowledge was not in the text itself, but in what it inspired doubt. Doubt could lead to questioning the very foundations of faith. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it could grow into something far more dangerous: blasphemy, heresy, even madness. Gregory had seen the effects of this firsthand. A few years ago, there had been a man in the village, Thomas by name, who had begun reading books of philosophy works that had been passed down from ancient times. books that spoke of human reason, of the natural world of logic. At first it seemed harmless, but soon Gregory noticed that Thomas had begun to ask questions. "Why must we suffer so?" he asked one day as they sat after Mass. "Why does God allow such pain and hunger in the world?" These were questions that could not be answered with the usual dogma. They were questions that threatened to unravel everything the church had taught. Thomas began to withdraw from the village rituals. He stopped attending Mass regularly, and when he did come, his prayers lacked the fervor that once marked his devotion. Instead, he became distant, almost withdrawn, as if he were searching for something more, something beyond the scriptures, beyond the confines of church doctrine. Gregory was troubled. The signs were clear. Thomas was succumbing to the temptation of forbidden knowledge of intellectual pursuits that led only to spiritual ruin. One evening, Gregory visited Thomas's home, arriving just as the man was sitting with a book in his hands, a tome of ancient philosophy that had come into his possession through a traveling merchant. The moment Gregory saw it, his heart sank. This was a book that questioned the very foundations of Christian belief. It was not a book of salvation, but one of damnation. Thomas Gregory said softly, stepping into the small cottage, "What is this?" He gestured to the book. Thomas looked up, startled, as if he had been caught in some kind of trap. His face flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment he said nothing. "You know better than this," Gregory continued, his voice steady but filled with authority. "The written word is not for your kind. Only the sacred texts are meant for the eyes of those who seek salvation. This is the work of the devil." Thomas trembled, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "But Father, I only wish to understand. I seek the truth." "Truth?" Gregory cut him off sharply. "There is no truth outside the Word of God. The world is full of lies. Thomas, in this book, is one of them. Do you not see? You are playing with fire. You are courting the devil, inviting his influence into your soul. You must burn this book. Destroy it before it destroys you." Thomas looked down at the book, his hands trembling. He had not seen it this way. It had been so tempting, so alluring, this new world of thought, of ideas, beyond what he had been taught. But now, as he looked at the priest, his mind began to falter. Was it truly so dangerous? Could knowledge, the very thing that had filled him with a sense of purpose, really lead him to damnation? "You must repent." Thomas Gregory urged, his voice softer now, yet still heavy with the weight of divine responsibility. "This is the only path to salvation. You must turn away from these books, these thoughts, these temptations. Only then will you be free." And so, in the presence of Father Gregory, Thomas did what he thought was the only way out. He burned the book. The flames consumed the pages, and with them, his once boundless curiosity. The questions, the thirst for knowledge, all seemed to vanish in the heat of the fire. But as the smoke rose into the air, so did a feeling of loss and emptiness that Thomas could not shake. He had been told that intellectual pursuit outside the church was a sin, but now a part of him wondered, was he simply a pawn in the great game of spiritual control? Had he been manipulated by the very institution that promised to save his soul? The questions lingered, but they were now buried beneath the weight of duty, of fear, and of his obedience. in the medieval world to read was to invite temptation. It was a dangerous act, one that could lead a person down a path of spiritual ruin. And for those who dared to read for pleasure, for those who sought knowledge beyond the sacred texts, the consequences were severe. The thirst for intellectual freedom was a quiet rebellion, one that threatened the very foundation of the church's power. And so, in the eyes of the clergy, reading was not just a pastime, it was a forbidden pursuit, a dangerous flirtation with the unknown. But the question remained, could a soul once touched by knowledge ever return to the safety of ignorance? Or did the pursuit of truth always lead to damnation, no matter the cost? As we bring tonight's journey to a close, let us pause for a moment to reflect on the world we have traversed, an intricately woven tapestry of suspicion, fear, and the eternal battle between the visible and the invisible. The medieval worldview was not simply a way of seeing the world, it was a way of living within it. Every action, every gesture, every fleeting thought was fraught with meaning, laden with the weight of spiritual consequence. To be human in medieval Europe was to live under a constant cloud of uncertainty, where the boundaries of the known world were always shifting, and where every moment, no matter how ordinary, could in the eyes of the people carry the possibility of extraordinary danger. Daydreaming, a natural and harmless diversion in modern life, was seen as a direct invitation for demonic forces to take root within the mind. Talking to oneself, an act of private reflection, or a necessary method for problem solving, was regarded with the deepest suspicion, a telltale sign of someone communing with the supernatural. And even the purest expressions of joy, laughter, crying, or even the simple wish to be left alone could brand someone as spiritually compromised, an unwitting participant in a game far larger than they could possibly understand. What we now consider harmless quirks, personal needs, or everyday behaviors were in medieval Europe viewed as acts of rebellion against divine order, dangerous breaches in the fragile human psyche. In this world, control was paramount. The social fabric was held together not by trust, but by fear. The church, which held the reins of knowledge, morality, and power, was the ultimate arbiter of what was right, what was acceptable, and what was worthy of suspicion. It didn't matter if you were a peasant living in a one-room cottage or a noble sitting in a grand hall. Everyone's thoughts, actions, and desires were subject to scrutiny. And in a world without modern science or psychological understanding, what was beyond comprehension was automatically classified as supernatural, something to be feared, something to be controlled. This deeply ingrained paranoia, the fear of being too happy, too quiet, or too thoughtful, was not just a feature of the medieval mind, but a tool for maintaining power. It kept people tethered to the established order under the watchful eyes of clergy neighbors and the ever-present gaze of suspicion. Individual expression, independent thought, and emotional freedom were seen as threats to this carefully balanced structure. A simple act of laughter, an unexplainable terror, or the solitary pleasure of reading could quite literally lead to one's downfall. The medieval world was a place where to be human was at times to live in a prison of the mind, a prison built on the belief that every soul no matter how pure, was vulnerable to the forces that lurked in the unseen realms. Yet within the walls of this fearful society, there was also a strange kind of beauty, an unquestionable bond that existed between the people. They shared the same burdens, the same fears, and ultimately the same desire to find meaning in a world that seemed to grow ever more threatening. Even as they lived in the shadow of suspicion, they found ways to express themselves, to laugh, to love, and to share their small joys. This paradox of living within a system of fear, yet still seeking moments of human connection, is what makes the medieval period so fascinating. It was a world ruled by rules, but still very much a world of people trying to survive, trying to live, and perhaps, most surprisingly, trying to find some measure of freedom within the constraints that bound them. So what can we take away from the medieval mind, from the shadows that loomed over every person's actions and thoughts? The lessons are perhaps not as far removed from us as we might think. In our own lives, we too face the occasional pressure to conform to fit into roles that are handed down to us, to walk the narrow path that society deems acceptable. And yet we are blessed with the freedoms that medieval men and women could hardly imagine. The freedom to dream, to daydream, even without fear of being branded a heretic. The freedom to laugh alone, without worrying that our joy might be viewed as a gateway to something dark and unholy. The freedom to read what we choose, whether it's a novel, a scientific paper, or even an ancient manuscript, without the fear of being accused of spiritual corruption. It's humbling in a way to realize how far we have come from those days when intellectual curiosity could cost a person their soul, when personal reflection could lead to an exorcism, and when happiness was seen as a sign of moral decay. We live in a world where knowledge is a right, laughter is a gift, and daydreaming is the doorway to creativity rather than to madness. How fortunate we are then that we no longer live under the shadow of suspicion, that our minds are free to wander, and our emotions are no longer subject to the whims of unseen forces. As you reflect on the medieval worldview, take a moment to appreciate the simplicity of a modern life that allows you to close your eyes and drift into a daydream without fear. Imagine laughing to yourself at a private joke or reading a book simply because it brings you joy. These things, once considered dangerous, are now our right, our privilege, and our solace. So, next time you catch yourself staring out the window, or when you find yourself humming a tune while walking alone, or perhaps even reading a book just for the pleasure of it, remember this: you are living in a time of profound freedom, a time where your mind is your own and your soul can wander unimpeded. And with that, my friends, I encourage you to celebrate that freedom, laugh, loudly read, voraciously, and yes, by all means, daydream without fear. In a world that once sought to trap the human spirit, we have broken free. Let us enjoy that liberation to its fullest, for in the end, the ability to express ourselves freely is the greatest gift of all. Good night, and may your dreams be your own.